Hello there. My name is Daniel Van Zant, and this is Radically Interdisciplinary. Today, I get the chance to talk to Robin Hanson. Officially, he's an associate professor of economics at George Mason University, but to say that's all he is would do his work a disservice. He's done work that touches on psychology, sociology. I even read a little bit of neuroscience in his book, The Hidden Elephant in the Brain, and he's even delved into metaphysics and religion with a recent paper on what is the sacred. He has a podcast with Agnes Callard called Mind's Almost Meeting. He has two great books. One, The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. And the second, The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life, When Robots Ruled the World. And I couldn't be more excited to talk to him today. So how are you doing, Dr. Hanson?
Nice to meet you, Daniel. What should we talk about first?
I think a good softball question is, what has been the main thing that's been occupying your thoughts this past week?
Well, this past week, I was in San Francisco visiting my son and his new child, so my first grandchild. And the airline industry disappointed me because I was scheduled to come back last Tuesday, and my flight was canceled after 8 hours after it was scheduled to leave, and then we had checked our bags and took all night to get the bag back. And then they scheduled another flight for 2 days later, and that was canceled. And then I got another flight 2 days later, and that was last night, and that finally went through.
Wow. So that's what, like 3 or 4 days total from the time you were originally supposed to fly out?
It was like a 4-day delay, yeah. A little over 4-day delay in 4.5 day basically delay. So yeah, so I wasn't very happy, but at least I got to spend more time with my grandchild. But I was, taken aback from my other usual things. But I think I developed a plan to focus on a new topic that in that last few days. And if that sticks, then that will have been an important thing that mattered, I guess.
Okay. And I think your frustration with the airline industry is kind of a good segue into talking about what you do or what your main interest is, which is you identify yourself as a institutional innovator. What does that mean exactly?
Well, I'm a professor of economics as my formal job, and I've spent many decades studying social science and economics, and in particular, I've focused on institutions to some degree and on designing new institutions. So, of all the different things I've studied, I think some of my most valuable contributions are ideas for new institutions. Now, whether those will actually turn out to be my most valuable contributions depends substantially on whether the world actually does something with them. And that's an issue I hadn't fully appreciated when I first went down this path.
I'd be very interested in holding a betting market on what is Robin Hanson's most valuable contribution going to be.
Well, I could do a Twitter poll, but then I'll only have 4 options.
We'll have to figure out a better way to do that. And so you identify yourself as an institutional innovator. When I first heard that, that just sounds like someone that's sort of interested in politics, but that's not quite true. You're a little bit different from a political thinker, a political writer in the method you use, right?
Right. So our world is full of technology in the most abstract sense. Technology just means ways to arrange things such that things go better. So better technology is better ways to arrange things. We arrange physical devices, we arrange software, and we arrange social processes, including within firms and law and governance and larger society. And innovation is what drives growth. The reason why we're rich is innovation. Innovation is coming up with better technologies. And so we come up with better technologies, not just of how to arrange physical devices or processes by which we use physical devices, and how to arrange software and how to use it, but also how to arrange our social interactions. And that's a kind of technology. And that's a kind of technology that also has great potential to give us much higher growth and returns, because if we have a better arrangement of social interactions, then we can be more productive and get more stuff we want. And I started out long ago in physics, actually. And then I switched to computer science. And then I later switched to social science. And in part, I was familiar with innovation in physical devices and innovations in software, computer uses. And then I realized there were all these innovations possible in social arrangements. And it seemed to me that it was much easier for me to find big, powerful innovations in social arrangements than it was in computers or physics. And that's part of what drew me to becoming a social scientist, is I saw all these big ways we could just do things much better in the social world. Now, I didn't think it through at the time. That is plausibly one of the reasons it's so much easier to find social improvements is that we don't actually adopt them very often. Whereas with physical devices or software, there are large industries really eagerly looking for new improvements. And if they find them, they will jump all over them and put a lot of investment into testing them and developing them and fielding them. And we don't have those industries really with respect to social innovations. And that's why we don't actually adopt social innovations as often. And that's why it's so much easier to find improvements because, first of all, finding an idea for an improvement isn't enough to get the improvement actually adopted. And secondly, not many people are looking for the improvements because there's not much of a market for them. So that was my misunderstanding early in life, is that I saw this area where you could just identify big improvements, and I didn't realize this further obstacle. But still, the overall innovation process, starts with some concept of how something could be better. And then this concept can be refined and thought through more carefully and reified into some writings that describe it. And you could even do math models in some cases of them, or computer simulations of them. And then you want to do tests, small scale tests of the ideas. And then all actual innovation is going to be a combination of some simple, elegant ideas and a bunch of messy details. And you need to search in the space of messy details to find the ones that work to make the elegant idea actually function. And that's part of what small scale tests are about, is to search in the space of variations to make it work. And then when you find variations that work on a small scale test that inspires you to do a larger scale test, when you will then need to do more search, because what works at small scale doesn't always work at a larger scale. And as you work to larger and larger tests on larger scales, and it still succeeds, then eventually the largest scale is lots of people using it. And that's success. Innovation's actually been adopted. That's the standard path of innovation. That's how we do most physical device innovation. That's how we do most software, computer innovation. And that's how we should be doing social innovation. And there are a fair number of people like myself who describe abstract ideas of innovation. And then they maybe do math models or lab experiment tests about them. And then the small scale field trials, where we actually try things out in the field and everything, that's where our world mostly drops the ball. There isn't a budget for that. There aren't people who are paying to do that. There's not much interest in doing that. And that's where I, by myself, can't make things happen. That is, even if I could get some money, you also need an organization that's willing to actually try something. And it's hard to find organizations willing to do that. So I have accumulated a backlog, a set of ideas that are ready for small scale trials. But what the world needs is that. Right? Now, there are amazingly a lot of people willing to pontificate about politics. And they're willing to do so with great passion and energy and spend large percentages of their life arguing about what sort of grand changes should happen to the world and their city and their nation and how we should do things different. But mostly that's around sort of ideology and some sort of like sense of what a just good world looks like. And it's not around some more specific concept of a different structure that would make things work better. And then they're very eager to do the small scale tests. So, there's people, when you've got some reasonably large tests that succeeded, then there'll be people out there willing to argue about whether we should do even larger scale tests, because now that's politics. And a lot of people love to be involved in politics. And we got people on the other end who'd like to just think abstractly about different arrangements and then talk about those very abstractly. And the middle place is where we drop the ball. So if you're out there in the world and you want the world to have better social arrangements, I tell you there are a lot of great ideas for social arrangements that are possible. And what you need is those intermediate tests.
So that's kind of the way you differentiate yourself from politicians or political thinkers, is that you're interested in testing these ideas and sort of using the process of science. And that segues well into my next question, which is, do you think institutional innovation is a field of science? Is it something that you can sort of form theories about and test hypotheses on? Uh,
So there's a difference between science and engineering/design, well-known difference. Science tends to be trying to find abstract claims that you can defend that are robust and apply in a wide range of contexts. Engineering is about designing particular things. Some elements of engineering are general claims of which science can verify, but engineering has a different goal. Rather than describing the world as it is, it's to search and find a design that would be helpful in some context. And a lot of engineering design is going to be a lot of local, messy detail, which most people don't consider science. That is, most businesses, for example, have to make a bunch of decisions, and those decisions are based on beliefs about the business's customers and its production processes, and its employees, et cetera. But we don't consider those claims science because of they're local to that particular business. They aren't general claims that will be true for centuries. And so there are truths that a business needs to know to function. And a part of a business is to design not only its organizational processes, but its products and its production processes and its distribution and marketing processes for that. And so there's a sense in which we don't call all of those truths science, but they are truths. They are more context dependent truths. And they're more about what should we do and what would be most effective. And so they're in some sense just less general than a general claim about science. But businesses and everyone else uses very general claims as an input to what they do. But this helps make a distinction between where we drop the ball. So there are academic fields that study institutions in general, and they study concepts of institutions. And so some of them will study actual existing institutions and write papers analysis of that. We'll call that science. And some of them might even study some abstract description of an institution and do some sort of game theory model of it or a lab experiment of it, and they'll call that science. And then the actual practice of particular businesses won't be called science, and it won't get the sort of academic prestige that you get for the former stuff, which is why it's being neglected. So a key thing to know is that science is really just a subset of academia. And academia is a social institution whose main social function is to credential impressiveness. That is, there are all these different ways to be impressive as an academic, and you have to get some particular discipline to certify you as impressive through publications and grants and jobs and things like that. And science is one way to do that. And so if you can make a useful contribution to a business, it isn't called science or academia if it's not very impressive, if you didn't have to use very difficult methods to do it. So we drop the ball as soon as you have a simple idea for an institution change that doesn't look very impressive in terms of what it took to make that idea or test it. And unfortunately, what the world needs is a lot of relatively simple ideas that are just tried out. And that's what isn't called science or doesn't get academic credit because it just looks too easy.
So in that case, you would consider yourself not in the conspiracy theory sense of the word, but just in the word's meaning, as more of a social engineer than a social scientist.
Right, where I'm more on the border in the sense that I'm thinking of relatively general proposals for institutions, but I'm focused on keeping them very simple and thinking through what the various practical obstacles they would face and trying to set them up to be testable and figure out where they could most easily be tested. And that part is not considered science. Maybe engineers wouldn't consider it engineering yet either. It's maybe a concept design, a prototype design, et cetera. Like, there's a whole process that has to go there from some abstract idea to more specific things. And maybe you wouldn't call this engineering either. I don't know. I don't necessarily care. The point is, it needs to be done. And we are dropping the ball at this point in the process.
And so you sort of have this idea of institutions as credentialing impressiveness. And I realize that one data point in the other direction doesn't invalidate a trend, but it would seem that your career would tell me the opposite, where you've been doing this kind of research uh, and just sort
Well,
of taking the next simple step.
honestly, I've done many different things, and the institutional design things I've done are give me the least academic credit. My academics credit me the least for that part of my research portfolio, even if I would consider it the most valuable. And in fact, I just fail to get people to actually do the small scale trials that I want people to do. So I would say I am not succeeding at getting people to do these small scale trials I want, and or even pursuing the larger ideas I have. But I do other things that people find interesting and impressive. And so I get what reputation I have from those other things.
Interesting. I see. And so the things that academia is crediting you for are the things that it wants, and that's sort of what you're doing. And
Right.
Even though you would say that the most impressive stuff and the most important stuff to you, in your opinion, is sort of this stuff that's not getting rewarded.
Right. So there's a sense in which what I think is most valuable, if it eventually gets adopted, should be seen objectively as impressive, but it isn't impressive in the way that academia cares about. So academia needs you to do a thing that's impressive in a way that a reviewer of your journal article or grant proposal can look at and see as impressive and verify at the time you do it or propose to do it that is impressive. That's different than waiting and seeing some larger scale social impact over decades or centuries. That doesn't count as impressive for academics' point of view because they need to see, right there in the product that it's impressive.
And do you think that this is a discredit to academia that it's set up this way, or do you think that just sort of this other thing should be more in the context of business, and there's other institutions to do small, simple steps?
Well, to recurse, this is a question of institution design. That is, our world is full of some existing institutions which achieve their existing functions. And there are many things our existing institutions don't do, therefore don't do well. And what we want is develop new, better institutions to better achieve the things the existing institutions don't do well. So it's an open question whether that would best accomplished by changing and varying some existing institution or just introducing an entirely new institution. We could go into some detail there, but certainly one generic question. One way you think about institution design is to look at your existing institutions and say, what are they bad at? What are they not doing well? And that is the place to start in saying, okay, how could we design an institution to better do those things? But all our existing institutions do some things well. And in some sense, that's what they're there for. They're there to do the things they do well. There are just other things we'd like to be done that none of them are doing well.
Are you familiar at all with the assembly theory?
Assembly?
Yeah, it's sort of a theory in complex systems, and it's just one of the reason I ask is what you're saying sounds very familiar from an assembly theory perspective. Because one of the main tenets of assembly theory is the things that exist, whether it's a person or a bug or an institution, exist because they're really good at doing something that propagates their existence, and there's sort of a
Right.
selection effect there. So
That
it
I
sounds
don't
like,
know by that name, but yes, my larger view of the world is that things that exist because there's some process that lets them continue to exist and promote themselves. Our world is full of things that exist for that reason. And then there's other things we want to achieve, and there's a mismatch. The things that exist don't necessarily achieve the things we want.
very interesting. And
All of
so
this could get more concrete if we pick some specific institutional problem or design challenge. Happy to let you choose something particular.
I I think I'm actually very interested in your design challenge that you mentioned with academic institutions, partially because that's sort of what I'm entrenched in. And in my field, with sort of artificial intelligence, I would consider myself much more of an engineer than a scientist, and many of the people I work with much more engineers than scientists. And so they'll be doing work that goes out into the real world and is helping people or inventing new technology. And then the tenure committee comes and says, "Hey, you haven't published any papers," or the professor comes and says, "Hey, where's your
Right.
papers?" or "Where's this?" or "Where's that?" Even though in terms of sort of real world impact, they're having much more of a real world impact than someone who's publishing 20 papers a year.
Right. So there's two relevant institutions here. We might think of these companies that are getting value from these products and whether they pay for it. So obviously you could, in some sense, incorporate yourself into a small business that offers these products and services for paying customers. And then we could ask, why is that going wrong too? So in some sense, the failure to do any one thing is the failure of all existing institutions not to do it. We don't just blame academia in this case. We'll blame every other institution we have for not doing this. And so surely there must be a story in your case about why this would be difficult to just make as a product to sell.
And that idea of talking about all existing institutions is really interesting to me. So you almost have in your head a meta institution that is all existing institutions that exist in our society,
World.
In the world, and we can talk usefully about that meta institution, and then once we've sort of identified our problem, drill down to the institution that we need to change or the new institution we need to create.
If you have in mind some particular engineering designs that you can create and that create value in the world, then the puzzle is, why don't any existing institutions promote that process by which you generate these algorithms, and then the world benefits from it and somehow pays for it? So again, we don't just blame academia. We'll blame every other institution for also failing to do whatever it is you were doing. So if I think of a reform for academia, it's not going to be a reform that makes academia do everything possible that would be valuable. It would only be maybe taking the larger space of things near what academia does now successfully and doing a larger set of those. So we could expand the scope of what academia could successfully achieve, even if this new academia still won't achieve everything worth doing. But if we look at the things academia says it's trying to do or claims to do, and then we look at what it actually does, we'll find a shortfall. And then we can more focused design better institutions by which something like academia today would in fact achieve those things it's now claiming or hoping to do. So that's how I would pitch a academic reform proposal, is to say, let's look at what academia claims to do and then try to get something to actually do that.
And I suppose the other thing you could do is sort of what's done with advertising regulations, where you say you either need to do the thing you claim to do, or you need to stop claiming that you're able to do the thing.
Well, if you could regulate such claims, but I don't know that we can very effectively. That is, I don't see much support for that regulation in our world. So there are many high prestige institutions in our world that claim to do a lot more than they actually do. And we mostly let them get away with it because we like to affiliate with prestigious institutions, and we like to affiliate them more when they make broad, high claims about what they do. So it might be better just to find a way to get them to actually do them.
What a strange thing that is for humanity, that it's better to engineer and work hard on a solution to make reality meet what you're saying than to make an institution be honest. But I absolutely see what you're saying there.
There's not that much demand for honesty, really.
No.
About such things. That is, if there was a demand, then we could try to design a better institution to achieve it. So certainly one issue in institution design is we have many ideas in our heads about what we think people want or should want. And then we see an institution not achieving this thing that people say they want or think they want. And then we are asking, how can we design this institution to better achieve it? But if it's not something they actually want, this isn't very doable, because you could design something that actually achieves the things they say they want. But if they don't actually want this, they're not actually going to choose it or support it. And you're going to fail. So I think a first step is to ask, what do people actually want? Even if they're not being very honest about it. And then we have a hope, maybe, if we can design an institution that achieves that, then maybe we could get them to adopt it. So that's what I'd certainly have to say about academia. Academia has the pretense that it, deals with all big, grand, abstract topics, and that it produces intellectual progress toward better, more accurate, insightful answers to those questions. And then academia as a practice doesn't really do that very well. Academia as a practice is mainly focused on particular people and in groups preserving their prestige and showing they're more impressive than somebody else, and doing what it takes to defend their territory of we're the most prestigious people on some topic X. And they do a good job of that, and other people succeed in affiliating with those people and getting prestige by association. And so students and funders and journalists can all successfully gain prestige by association with the currently declared to be most prestigious people on various topics. And that's what academia succeeds at. What it doesn't succeed at is actually advancing intellectual progress in those areas at a substantial rate, or validating more accurate claims as true relative to less accurate claims. It claims to do those things, and people like to give it credit for doing those things as a way to affiliate with them, but it doesn't really do those things very well. So the question is, could we design something that would do those things better? And I have my best guess for how to do that.
Very interesting. And so this is a really interesting question of honesty and of things doing things that are against their incentives. And I think it's a really great segue into this idea of a meta institution that it seems like has sort of followed you your whole career, which is prediction markets.
So prediction markets is a technology it's basically betting markets. And betting markets is a technology we've had for a long time. The novelty is to figure out new things you could use it for. And so in order to find new institutions, you need both new technologies and also new insights about how to apply them. So a betting market in history has been very successful at producing accurate odds on the topic bet. And that's something we've just seen for a very long time. And you can put up a betting market against a wide range of other institutions, and it will consistently just do better. With similar resources and information, it will be able to produce more accurate estimates about whatever question that is. And that's a powerful technology we have not used in as wide of many places as we could. So then the challenge is to identify how to use it. Now, there are many people, unfortunately, who say, oh, prediction markets are great, betting markets are great, and they just create a website where you can go declare anything you want to bet on and then go bet on it, and then they think they're done. Like, we have realized the potential of prediction market because there's some place you can go declare a claim and bet on it. And I go, no. What we want to do is connect this to particular things in the world where we get value from more accuracy and create a practice of actually using it that way. So, for example, most organizations have projects with deadlines, and it's often important to know whether a project will make a deadline. And so you can make a prediction market on a project deadline and find out, will you make the deadline? The challenge is then to get organizations into the habit of doing that. And that hasn't been successfully done so far. That is, people have done some project deadlines, but they haven't created a regular practice, a regular habit of doing it, such that organizations, whenever they have a project with a deadline, would just go, oh, of course, and let's do the prediction market on the project deadline. They don't see it as valuable enough to be in the habit of just expecting to do that. That's the place we need to get to. We need to do them and show that they are valuable and show that they are cost effective and get people in the habit of doing them because they see other people with projects do them. That's the sort of thing that we need and isn't done by somebody just throwing up a website saying, hey, you can bet anything you want here. And there are many other potential applications of prediction markets that I think would be especially valuable. But the challenge is to do it, to get a track record of having applied them in a certain way on a particular kind of problem and show people that that track record is there, and to show people how to use it so that they would then be in the habit of doing it. So whenever you have a project with a deadline, you just set up a prediction market on whether it will make the deadline, and that would just be what you do. But we aren't there yet. So that's the thing I think we need to do, is more small scale trials of targeted applications like that. You do a project with a deadline and you try to experiment with the different ways you could do that, different people to include, different incentives, different visibility, different ways to define the projects and the variations on the projects, and figure out which variation tends to work best and get a track record of how successful that is, and then entice other people to copy. That's what you're trying to do.
It seems to me that there have been quite a bit of empirical trials and empirical evidence on prediction markets.
Well, at a high level of abstraction, but you need it at that specific level. So everybody in the world, when they're thinking of adopting a technology, they want to know, this thing that I'm doing right now, has this technology been shown to work for this? They don't want to hear some abstract thing, right? They want to know this. Like if I have a lawn that I want to mow and you say, hey, internal combustion engines, that could work. What if you put a sharp thing on an internal combustion engine? Couldn't that cut your lawn? And I'm like, oh, maybe in the abstract, but have you shown, if you showed me an actual lawnmower and it was available and you'd shown me how it had mowed other lawns nearby, I might go, okay, yeah, I want that. You show me the abstract internal combustion engine, that's not good enough to convince me that I want to mow my lawn with a lawnmower. You have to show me a lawnmower. You have to get the technology applied close enough to what I'm trying to do and show a track record of it working and show it being, available enough. Then that's when I'm going to apply it. So that's what we haven't done with prediction markets, right? An abstract sense of the markets have, been tried on a bunch of things and done reasonable accurate. That's like showing me that internal combustion engines are out there and they're used for things. Okay, fine, but I'm trying to mow the lawn here. Show me that it works for mowing my lawn.
And so what we need, if I'm understanding you correctly, something like a large corporation, like let's say Google, and they say, for whatever reason, the CEO of Google says, I love prediction markets. I think they're great. I'm going to start using them for everything this company does and tell everyone underneath me to do the same. And then for people to sort of see that success.
That's too much, actually. That would be bad. That is, I'd rather they picked a particular project and say deadlines. We're going to have markets on all the different project deadlines and see how that goes. And, develop, compare the different ways we could do it and try different experiments and then develop a standard practice. This is our standard best practice. And then get a track record of data on that. That is, you want to go for some particular application and show that it works rather than just try to do it for everything.
And why would it be bad? It seems like if this thing is good and helps companies make better decisions, you'd want to go full bore straight ahead.
Well, you want to show that it works on particular things. Again, everybody in the world is doing in their mind something particular. And in order to convince them to use a new technology, you have to show that this technology works in their particular context. It's not enough to show that it works in some abstract sense on other things out there. So that's why to convince people to use things, you need to show them a track record of successful application close enough to the thing they're doing. And that's just generically true of all technology. You just need particular trials that are close to what they're doing. Now, in some sense, we have had a number of trials of things like project deadlines in prediction markets. And so we can learn some of the things that have gone wrong there and get a hint about what some of the limiting factors are in terms of what we need to do better on. That's going the next step in the iteration of design.
I see. So when you're designing something, you don't want to jump way, way ahead because then you'll hit all of the issues that you didn't test for. This is why people that are making software beta test it with a small group, and then they expand the group and expand the group.
Right. If you don't just say, hey, software has been useful for people in the world, why don't you use software for your problem? You would say, here's a particular kind of software that you might want to use for your problem. And then they might want to see that particular kind of software has been successfully used for that particular kind of problem.
That makes a lot of sense. So I have plenty of other questions about institutional innovation and prediction markets, but you had something that you wanted to discuss that you talked to me about before we started the podcast, and I wanted to make sure we had time for it. And we can sort of loop back to all of these questions.
Well, let me just pop in. This will be a slight change of topic, but computational neuroscience, I saw in your title. So I have this book, The Age of M, on brain emulations. So the concept of a brain emulation, as I presume is that you scan a particular human brain in great detail. You see which cells are where connected to what and what type those cells are, even what type the connections are. And then you have computer models of how each kind of cell works. And then if you make a computer simulation of that brain where for each actual cell, you make a simulated version of that cell that has the same type of that cell and has a model of how that cell type works, then if you've got your scan of the brain in good enough detail and your models of the cell types are of good enough detail, then in principle, when you run the simulation, it should have the same input-output behavior. You send signals into its eyes and it thinks about them, and its ears hear something, and then it instructs its fingers to do something, and it would go through that whole process the same way the original brain would in the same situation. That's the concept of a brain emulation. And my book about that was called The Age of M. And for example, when I talked to my colleague Tyler Cowan about this book, and he said, "Oh, that's just crazy." Why? Because I haven't heard neuroscientists talking about it. So because he hadn't heard any neuroscientists in his personal experience, I don't know how many neuroscientists he thinks he's ever experienced, but he had never heard neuroscientists talk about this concept of brain emulation. So he thought, well, I don't need an opinion about that. Your book is just crazy because this just isn't a thing anybody should be talking about because I never hear neuroscientists talk about it. So I want to ask you, Mr. Neuroscientist, have you ever heard of this concept? Is this sound to you like an incoherent concept? Does it sound to you like something that just doesn't make sense on the basis of neuroscience? Or is it just something we can't do yet, but would make sense eventually?
So I've definitely heard of it from other neuroscientists. You should send Tyler Cohen to my lab because we talk about this. I probably have several conversations about this a week with my colleagues who are neuroscientists, actually. And we talk about this quite a bit. I think the reason that most neuroscientists don't talk about this is that neuroscience is a very clinical field. And so they're trying to sort of solve particular problems, and they're trying to say, all right, well, how do I cure Alzheimer's, and how do I decrease this gene, and all of these other questions. And because of that, there's not a whole lot of neuroscientists, and I think this is a great shame, who are thinking about and studying the brain as a whole. For, I would say, 80% of neuroscientists, at least, they learn about the whole brain at some point while they're getting their PhD. But sort of the next 30 years of their practice, they're focused on zapping this one type of cell with an electrophysiological tool. And that's what they're thinking about. And they're thinking about how the genes and proteins in this one type of cell work, or something similarly focused. And so there are neuroscientists thinking about this. That's sort of the reason why I think most of them aren't thinking about it. And maybe it's not a bad thing. I think there's demonstrable value in clinical work that there isn't in sort of just learning and thinking about things. As far as what I personally think about brain emulation, I think that's a tough one. I've gone back and forth in my own head on
So
whether
what are the two positions you go back and forth between?
The two positions I go back and forth between are computational irreducibility, and that brains are, for whatever reason, and Stephen Wolfram gets into this a little bit, and what's his name? The physicist who wrote The Emperor's New Mind.
Penrose?
Penrose, that's it. I couldn't remember his name for a second. Penrose gets into this, and several others get into this, the idea that for whatever reason, the brain is too complex to be emulatable. And then the other side of it is sort of, I would say, a little bit more of the common sense side, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct one, which is the brain is a system and it has a particular set of mechanics, and computers are really good at simulating mechanics. And so as long as we have a big enough computer that's fast enough, we should be able to simulate all the mechanical processes happening in the brain, and thus simulate whatever information processing is happening.
So let me suggest that you think about this in terms of system modularity for a signal processing subsystem. So if we look at physical devices like computers or phones or TVs or whatever, these in our world are physical devices we make, and their primary function is signal processing. And then they are made out of enormously complicated materials, and the physics to simulate the entire physical system, the computation required for that would be enormous. But signal processing systems that we design are designed explicitly so that there is a much smaller set of degrees of freedom that represent the signal processing system than the entire physical system of which they're made. Right? That is, a logic gate in a computer, may be composed of millions of atoms, but the design is such that you don't need to look at the vibration or, rotational state of each of those atoms in order to figure out how the gate works. The gate is designed to be robust to and somewhat largely independent of most of those other degrees of freedom. That's how we can manage to successfully make signal processing systems. If we didn't do that, we really couldn't successfully design such systems and field them, because it would just be way too complicated to figure out what any one, physical system would do. So the idea is that we can only actually successfully design signal processing systems because we can isolate some degrees of freedom of the physical system as the degrees of freedom in which represent the signals and represents the interaction of the signals, from all the other degrees of freedom in the system, which are going to be largely irrelevant to that signal processing part. That's the only way we can successfully design signal processing systems. So if that's also true of evolution for the brain, it would mean that evolution in the brain, there are degrees of freedom in the brain that represent the signal, the state, and the signal being presumed. But then there's all these other vastly larger number of degrees of freedom in the brain. But the brain couldn't have figured out how to design the signal processing system if it didn't find a way to make these degrees of freedom in the signal processing somewhat independent of, modular from, the other degrees of freedom in the system. That is, evolution in designing a brain faced that same sort of challenge, the design challenge of needing to isolate some limited number of degrees of freedom as the focus of the design and keep it separate from most other things. And this is honestly how we design most systems, right? Like if we have a building with a bunch of structural supports, each, say, strut has a limited number of degrees of freedom we care about, its position and its tensile strength and things like that. And then there's all these other degrees of freedom in that strut that we don't care about and that we design so that they don't matter that much, right? That's the only way we could design much of anything, is if we can focus on a limited number of degrees of freedom of a particular aspect of the system and get those degrees of freedom right in a way that other perturbances don't mess it up, right? So for signal processing, there would have to be these things that store state and that transfer state that would have to be relatively robust to all the other random stuff that's happening. And so this suggests that what we need to do is identify those key degrees of freedom in brain cells and identify what it takes to represent those degrees of freedom and their interdependence. But once we did that, we wouldn't need to model all the rest of the physical system in the brain cells, because they are, by construction, not mattering so much. That would be the argument for expecting some degree of simplicity. Now, that degree of simplicity could still be pretty large. I mean, the complexity could be very large in the sense that if a single cell was more like a single logic gate, then we expect there's just not that much in the cell that matters. The more that a single cell is like a whole microcomputer or something, then the more detail you have to get into to get those degrees of freedom, but still it will be small compared to the entire set of degrees of freedom that represent the cell.
So I might not be understanding what you're saying correctly, but it would seem to me that evolution in designing a system doesn't have one important limitation that we as humans have in designing a system, which is that we have to be able to think about the system and fit it all in our brain, or at least fit it all in our brain and a bunch of paper. to design it, and that's sort of why we have to intentionally limit our systems and limit the degrees of freedom. Whereas it seems to me that evolution could have an arbitrarily complex system that's using physical processes, where those physical processes are important at many, many levels, and it would be fine because evolution is just sort of doing something randomly, and if it works, it continues, and if it doesn't work, it's
So let's notice that modularity is important in biological design. So the human body is composed of a number of distinct organs which achieve distinct functions. And that should be a little puzzling from the point of view you just described. You have the skin, you have the blood vessels, you have the muscles, you have endocrines, you have a whole bunch of different systems, and they are each in a separate physical place with, a separate physical process happening. Whereas you might think, well, why can't a same cell simultaneously do something as a blood vessel and as a muscle and as an endocrine and as skin? Why have these separate systems? You might have thought modularity is only needed for limited brains who can handle limited complexity, but evolution wouldn't need to have modular subsystems. Even within cells, they are composed of modular sub-organs, each organ doing separate, distinct functions. So that suggests that modularity isn't just good for human limited brains. It's just more generally good when you're trying to do very complicated system design. And as evolution still has limits on its capacity to design, and modularity is an important method for dealing with those limits.
That's a really excellent
independence
point.
thing is I'm talking about is modularity. That is the idea that the signal processing subsystem is somewhat independent of the other systems is exactly a modularity concept. So you might ask, why do you have a heart in one place? Why not just have little hearts all through your body? Why not just have every cell doing a little bit of a hearty thing, right? Or why have separate muscles in separate places? Why can't your skin be muscly? And why can't your nose be muscly? And why can't your bones be muscly? Why can't everything be a little muscly? And the argument is, well, muscles need a bunch of different things to work together to function. And so they do all that design in one place together in a way that's somewhat isolated from other things. And then they can actually fit those things together in a way to make it work in a way they couldn't if they're trying to just make everything kind of muscly.
That's a really excellent point. And this is actually something I'll give a little bit of a shout out to my colleague, Rachel St. Clair. She got her doctorate not too long ago, and what she studies is modularity in the brain and how this is very important for being able to process information the way we do. To be fair, there are biological systems which I think are relatively non-modular, but that's mostly just fungus, and they're not sort of the systems that we're interested in building if we're interested in doing intelligent things, because it seems like they're quite bad at those types of things.
I think fungi have organs in different places that do different things. So, for example, a fungi with a stalk and a fruiting body, the stalk and the fruiting body are different things which serve different functions. And it sit in different places with different structures.
That's a really excellent point. What I was kind of thinking of is that one of the unique things about fungus is that I guess it just might be a different type of modularity, because we have sort of different types of cells. So I have blood cells and I have skin cells, and those are fundamentally different things with fundamentally different internal mechanisms. But one of the defining features of fungi is that they have one cell that self-organizes itself into all of those things. But I guess that's just a different way to get to modularity now that I think about it.
Right. So it's the way those cells are organized within each organ that produces that different way that different organ works, but the different organs are modular.
Very interesting. And then I guess as a secondary way to play devil's advocate within modularity, sort of on that brains might be non-simulable, would be that my intuition is that biological systems are almost infinitely modular. Whereas in terms of that, I've got different organs, and then those organs are made of cells, and those cells have different machinery inside of them. And then you can get into that machinery, and it's made of different types of molecules. And there's even some evidence that the brain is doing some sort of quantum computing once you get all the way down to the bottom. And it seems like physical system, the artificial systems, even the most complex ones, the modularity stops at some point, or at least it stops being important. So, like you said, there's still atoms that are interacting with each other in interesting and unique ways, in, say, a television. But we've sort of cut off the modularity that matters and cut out the noise at some point to where we don't care what those atoms are doing for the purpose of the physical artificial thing we built.
I guess I might say, think of a biological cell, think of a particular molecule, and ask, how many different functions is that molecule achieving? So if we think of the cell as broken into organs, like it has at least a dozen different organs that are achieving different functions, right? If the cell wasn't modular, then I might think each molecule would be achieving maybe half of all the functions. Whereas in a modular system, each molecule is probably only achieving one or two of the functions. That is, each molecule is part of one of the organs that is achieving the function of that organ, but not really achieving many other things, right? So you can see how that would be a way to define modularity. We'd ask, how many different functions is any one molecule achieving in the cell? And my guess is, in fact, it's not very many. That is, mostly the cell is composed of organs. Each organ has its set of molecules that together achieve its function, but those molecules are largely dedicated to that organ, and it's not a matrix organization where each molecule is simultaneously serving a number of different organs, and achieving their functions. And that would be a way in which cells are modular because of the difficulty of design. That is, the key idea is, when evolution is trying to redesign one of the particular organs in a cell, if each of the molecules is simultaneously achieving many functions in the cell, then it'll be hard to change that molecule without redesigning all those other organs. But if each molecule is only achieving a function in one organ, then it will be possible to change that molecule, and it only changes its function in that organ, and then you could just change it for the purpose of getting a better function in that organ without simultaneously having dealing with all its consequences everywhere else. And so if a brain cell has some parts of the cell that help it achieve its function as a brain cell, those will only be some of the molecules in that brain. It won't be all of the molecules in the brain that are participating in the brain cell part of this cell. Most of the parts of the cell will be doing all the other usual things that ordinary cells do. Every brain cell needs to achieve all the usual functions that cells achieve. And most of the molecules in a brain cell will be doing those things. And they really won't be doing much at all about the brain cell part of it. It'll be some limited set of molecules in a brain cell that will be doing the brain cell thing. Just like with muscles, right? Most molecules in a muscle aren't doing the muscle thing. It's a limited set of molecules in a muscle cell that are doing the muscle thing. And the same way for lots of other, cells that do other things in the body.
Interesting. So if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're saying that sort of our brain is doing lots of things that aren't actually important for information processing, but are necessary, like getting
Right.
toxins out of the brain through the cerebrospinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier. And we only need to actually emulate the information processing parts of the brain to emulate what we think of as the brain.
Exactly. In the same way that if you have a computer and it's got a logic gate, if you want to simulate that computer, you have to emulate the logic gate, but you won't have to emulate the rest of the matrix of metal, material around that logic gate and how it's interacting chemically or vibrating or whatever. You can ignore all that when you make a work-alike for the computer.
That's really fascinating. And then I guess as one last position from which to play devil's advocate from, there is evidence that sort of all of the things that the brain does, even the things that we wouldn't think of immediately as being important for information processing, are carrying some sort of information processing capability. For instance, what I talked about with the cerebrospinal fluid draining the toxins out of the brain, or the way the blood flows in the brain, not what any particular neuron is doing, but just where the oxygen in the blood is flowing to. Uh, those are doing some sort of larger scale information processing that seems to be important.
Well, they might encode state, and that state might be changing slowly, but that might be relatively little of the computation in a sort of bits per second sense. That is because the states are changing very slowly, right? So certainly even in right, if you think of a computer controller of a factory machine or something, right? I mean, there's the parts of the machine that are there's the parts of the computer that are doing fast computation, and then there's a machine with an arm that it's controlling, and that arm has a state, like it's pointing this way or that way, and has a position or something, and the computer needs to sense that in order to be part of its calculation. But that arm is changing really slow compared to the computer cycle of computation. So in some sense, the bits necessary to model that are just much smaller, right? That is, you don't need to model very much computation to capture that part of the system. So whenever you have slow systems coupled with fast systems, and you want to model that, most of the computation is going to have to be with the fast part, not with the slow part, unless the slow part has a lot more detail, say, that you have to keep track of. So, obviously, if you have a tiny, computer in a, solar nebula or something, even if the nebula is changing slowly, it could just be huge, and you have to keep a track of a lot of it.
That makes sense. And so what you're saying is emulation would still work if the computation being done by draining the toxins or having the blood oxygen flow around is slow, and thus could have the actual physical part needed to emulate it be relatively small.
Right. That is, you'll presumably when you model, do a brain emulation, you'll want to model all the parts of the co-evolving systems. There's a bunch of systems that are coupled to each other that are all interacting, but the computation you'll have to devote to the systems that are very slow will just be a lot less because they're not doing very much. But you would want to include them. So if there's like some degree of toxins at different parts of the brain and that slowly varies over the course of minutes, then fine. As it varies, you'll want to update some bits representing the toxin density. But again, this toxin density doesn't vary much spatially. The spatial variation is very slow and the time variation is very slow. So it wouldn't take very many bits to emulate.
That makes a lot of sense. I gotta say, the fact that you've been thinking about this and you've obviously been thinking about it so thoroughly is one of the reasons why I was really excited to have you on this podcast. Because, like I said at the beginning, officially you're an economist, but you're sort of thinking about all of these other things constantly. And I think that thinking about all of these other things probably makes you better at thinking about any particular thing than you would be if you weren't doing that.
I think there is a niche of a intellectual strategy in life, which is to learn about a lot of different areas and then collect a lot of different, just have seen a lot of different stuff and then look for intersections later. So that's a different strategy than learning a lot about one very specific area and just knowing everything about that and then doing the next thing in that area. It's a different strategy to just know a lot of different things and then notice connections. And the strategy of just seeing a lot of different things and making connections between them is a strategy that your productivity grows with the number of things you've seen. So that means over a lifetime, you'll have a peak productivity later, because it won't be later till you'll have seen more things that you could combine. So, obviously there's other things that affect productivity, maybe just raw energy, stamina, sharpness of thinking or something. And so there's a plausible story that focusing on one thing really thoroughly and effectively is going to be peak early in life, right? You're just going to be the best at that at, 23 or something. And because you can just really get into it and really see all the parts and just really think it through. But then you won't necessarily get better at that with life. And then your sort of raw stamina and sharpness will decline. And so you'll peak early on something where you just need to get into this one thing and just really get it really clear. Whereas if you collect just lots of different things and look for intersections, that's going to peak later. So I am later in life now. So I'm gaining the benefit of this lifelong strategy to see lots of different things and look for intersections. And I hope that you see that's roughly what I'm doing when I'm talking to you. I'm trying to make very simple arguments, but I'm drawing from a very wide range of things I've seen in order to make any particular point.
I've actually thought about exactly what you said about the strategy to peak first versus peaking later quite a bit. And one of the reasons why I kind of chose to do research and chose to do the kind of work that I'm doing is because I thought about it when I was comparing a few other career options at the end of my undergraduate degree. And I said, you know what? I would like for my peak to be at the end of my life rather than at the beginning. So that I don't sort of end up at the end of my life and say, oh, well, I did a great thing. And maybe I'm still at that level, but I'm not necessarily increasing as much as I'd like to.
I mean, that's an interesting fact about our psychology is that somehow we admire a life that's where abilities are increasing over a lifetime more than where it peaks early. I'm not sure there's a fundamental reason to prefer that. It is in some sense a gender difference. So, being male, this may be something as a male you're more prone to expect. I think women more peak early in terms of sort of their market value in some ways. And so they more have to accept and expect what a life looks like when you peak earlier, right? To the extent, that's important. Now, as an academic, of course, they could have these various intellectual strategies and peak later, just like anybody else could. But so I'm not saying women couldn't adopt the peak later intellectual strategies, but maybe your sort of admiration for the peaking later is more of a male thing because it appeals to you more. And that is, in some sense, more of a typical male life cycle of higher variance and then on the win side, peaking later. But, it's not. If you could peak early and do a great stuff, then I'm going to be a big supporter. I mean, I want people to just do whatever will have the biggest long-term. So, this is a key problem with academia as we have it, is just basically academia today rewards people for whatever produces most prestige, and it doesn't reward them necessarily for the most intellectual project. And there's also a sort of a bias toward youth in the sense that we actually seem to more admire potential relative to achievement. So, if you at a young age can seem to have great potential, that will actually do you better in life than if later on you actually make great achievements. Because, that'll happen late. And then by then people won't be so interested in you, even if you achieve great things. They're more interested in these people who seem to have great potential because then they can be slotted into, high influence, high prestige roles. And then they're valuable associates to have, etc. So, like many prestige processes, potential matters more than results.
I would say that's a very good insight, and I think I was actually thinking about this just the other day with there's a very famous poet, John Keats, and he died at 24, I believe. And I like poetry a lot, and every biography I've ever read about him says that what they focused on is how much potential he had, even though he did work while he was alive that can stand up against any other writers and is worth talking about in its own right. And I was thinking sort of along the same lines of what are the psychological reasons why even when his work can stand up against anybody else's, we're still more focused on what his potential was.
Right, because there's a sense in which that spoke better of his innate ability. That so there's a standard story that I think makes a lot of sense, which is when we are being artistic to each other and impressing each other, what we're impressing each other with is our genes. We're saying we have better genes, and so you should mate with us and have us as an allies in the gene world. So then in that sense, potential could be another way of saying, well, Keats had great genes. Anybody who could do poetry this good at that early an age has great genes, and maybe even greater genes than somebody who could do the same quality of poetry at a later age. And maybe what we care more about is the genes than the poetry itself. Poetry is just a way to figure out the genes. And so what we're really saying is, Keats had the best genes of all these poets, not because his poetry was best, but because he did his great poetry at an early age, which then spoke well of his potential via his genes. And so what we're really admiring is the genes. And that may be a plausible theory of a lot of admiration, is what we're admiring is the genes.
I've got a couple questions that I really wanted to ask you, and then
Okay.
I can let you go. I'm curious about. I had an old professor who used to always talk about his academic grandfathers.
Yeah.
And those are sort of the people who he wanted to model himself after in his career, and the people who were doing the kind of work that he wanted to do in his career and the kind of research. I was trying to think of who your academic ancestors might be, and I was sort of pulling up a blank. Who would you consider your academic ancestors?
So there's two kinds of grandfathers you can have in mind. One kind can be your immediate actual supervisors and mentors, people who are in your world directly promoting you and helping you. And for people who end up doing work very much like those supervisors and mentors, they, of course, loom very large in their mind. I mean, I obviously had supervisors and mentors, but I didn't end up doing work very much like them. So my work doesn't really reflect them in the sense of the topics or the conclusions. So another kind of thing would be just who, like, were your models or inspired you. And again, the more that you are in a particular research area and you stay in that, the more you would name somebody in that area who was important in that area, who sort of helped the area along. The more you have a broad range of topics, then that's not how it's going to work. So unfortunately, I have a broad range of topics, and what I've done isn't very closely related to any of the people who've mentored me or supervised me. So I don't have them to point to for that reason. I can point to the kind of people I have as models, but they're pretty far away from what I've done. But I think there's this basic fact that sometimes when people are nonconformists like myself, people frame this as not caring as much as what other people think. And they think of the secret for being nonconformist is not to care what other people think. And I don't think that's right. I think we all care a lot about what other people think, and you really can't not care what other people think. But what you can do is maybe choose who you care about. So you can put in your mind a particular person and say, I want this person to be impressed. And then if those other people are impressed, but you think this person will be impressed, that can still carry on. Like, you can resist those people's naysaying if somebody else in your mind is praising. So then the question is, who are you going to pick as this voice that's going to evaluate you? It's going to say, you're going to hold them up and say, what would they think? And so I think that's how I frame things, in terms of I pick people like Einstein or, really high, Herbert Simon, maybe Douglas Lennon to AI, other very people who have been very productive and creative. And I try to live up to their standards and to do stuff that they would be impressed with. And if other people around me who I think of as less than them aren't so impressed, is not so much of a problem. It would be a big problem if they weren't impressed, because they're the people I'm trying to impress. I don't think I can not be trying to impress anybody. I don't think that works. But I can pick who I'm trying to impress.
Hmm. So even as an associate professor, you sort of got a little advising committee, even if they only exist in your brain, uh, of people, and you're thinking of, oh, would Einstein or Feynman or these other great scientists sort of approve of the type of thing I'm doing?
But if you looked at the range of things they did and sort of how ambitious they were in their ideas and how careful they were, et cetera, and you say, well, if I could do that well, then, they'd be proud of me and I could be proud of myself.
Very fascinating. You've a lot of your work revolves around people's beliefs and how those beliefs change and how we can have the most rational beliefs. What is the largest belief change that you've had personally?
I think, initially I had some bunch of belief changes early in my education, say relativity, quantum mechanics. There's just sense in which those were just radically different than I had any right to expect. But I sort of assimilated those relatively early on. Later in life, I was surprised to just see how different people are from what they think they are. So, my book, The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life, is about how we're just really wrong about why we do many things. And I was just really surprised about how wrong we could be. And relatedly, I was surprised to know just how broken the world is. That is, our institutions are really quite far from optimal. They're really far. They're not just a little bit off and need a little bit of patching. They are just very far. And that's related to our motives being different than we thought. Given the motives that most people think they have, they wouldn't let things get that bad. If things were that bad, why, we would get together and work on it and make sure we fixed it, because we just, we wouldn't tolerate things that bad. But we're not who we think we are. We are not really that bothered by things being that bad, as long as it doesn't reflect on us personally. So we just let things get really bad. And so, that means there's enormous potential. If we would ever, some of us, get together enough to actually come up with better institutions, we could be really vastly better off, all of us. But we don't. I mean, like, I am a cryonics customer, and cryonics is this process by which, when medical science gives up on you, basically they freeze you, and in a state in liquid nitrogen where you don't change anymore, and you wouldn't change for centuries. And so later on, if medical science could revive you centuries from now, then that would be possible from a frozen cryonics patient. And my book, The Elephant in the Brain, is about how, you could take cryonics frozen patients and make a brain emulation out of them, and then they could come back as a brain emulation. And that seems like, if that was an acceptable way to live on, most people who die today don't need to die. And that's pretty shocking, because most people think they really don't want to die, and dying is just a really terrible thing they would really try hard to avoid. And then there's this way that most of them don't actually have to die. And certainly, if a lot more people chose cryonics, it would be a lot more reliable and cheaper. So then a lot more people wouldn't have to die. So, from the counterfactual of a lot more people choosing it, it seems like if a lot more people chose it, it would be cheap and reliable. And then most people who are dying today wouldn't need to die. And yet they're dying. So, that's pretty surprising. That's remarkably surprising, in the sense that there's this world of people who think they don't want to die, who think dying is the worst thing. And there's this simple way they could not die, and they don't do it. Like, we're just not who we think we are. Clearly, their self-concept of somebody who doesn't want to die and would do most anything to avoid it is just not true. They are a different sort of creature from that. And so am I, of course. I'm not trying to say I'm special. We're all quite different creatures than who we thought we were.
And I think it's a great credit to how well written and persuasive your book, The Elephant in the Brain, is, that when I was reading it, I almost had a painful cognitive dissonance, where I almost didn't want to read it, and I wanted to read it slowly, or things like this.
Yes, well, so you should credit my co-author for its quality of writing. He's mostly to be credited for that. I'm not as good a writer as he, but I'm glad that we were able to work together on that.
But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I sort of experienced a miniature version of what the belief change you're talking about is, when I read it, and it's been percolating in my brain for a while now. All of these kinds of ideas. I think it'll probably take a while to finish percolating, because of how much cognitive dissonance there is with that.
The world and we are just very different than what we thought.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a last question?
I did. Is there anything that you are interested in promoting of your own, before we close off the podcast, or anything you would recommend to people?
Well, I'm interested, of course, in people trying these various institution ideas that I have that we haven't actually talked specifically about, including decision markets and crime vouchers and career agents and health agents and a lot of other ideas I'd be like people to pursue. I've done this work on grabby aliens the last few years, and people are interested in learning about where are the aliens in space time. The last year I did this work on the sacred, I guess, as you said. And so, I'm like to promote whatever ideas of these people think are interesting.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for being willing to talk with me. This is one of my favorite conversations that I've had in the past week or past month or past several months. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, nice talking to you, Daniel.
Absolutely. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to Radically Interdisciplinary. If you enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy this workshop I led up with Robin Hanson and 3 other luminaries on artificial life, artificial intelligence, and the Fermi paradox. A link to that, as well as links to everything mentioned in this episode and other resources that someone who enjoyed this episode might be interested in, is on my website, danielvanzant.com. I have the link to that page in the description of wherever you're listening to this. Finally, I am proud to do this podcast as well as the workshop I mentioned as a member of Florida Atlantic University's Machine Perception and Cognitive Robotics Lab and Florida Atlantic University Center for Future Mind. Thank you for listening.